place this is. We believe there are many paths to truth, to kindness and to goodness and meaning. We believe that we need not think alike to love alike. We celebrate difference and diversity. We believe they are not merely things to be tolerated, but actually a source of strength, something that makes us wiser and better as a congregation than we would be otherwise. At the same time, of course, it does matter what a person believes. Beliefs drive behavior. Beliefs have repercussions. Not all beliefs bear good fruit. The 20th century religious educator Sophia Lyon-Fawes wrote, "Some beliefs are like walled gardens. They encourage exclusiveness and the feeling of being especially privileged. Other beliefs are expansive, and they lead the way into wider and deeper sympathies. Some beliefs are divisive, separating the saved from the unsaved, friends from enemies. Other beliefs are bonds in a world community, where sincere differences beautify the pattern." There are many paths to truth and meaning, and it does matter what you believe. And from that set of sometimes seemingly conflicting values emerged that question I received in the question box sermon a few weeks ago: is it okay to be intolerant of hate? In other words, how do diversity-loving, tolerant people respond to intolerance? And several of you turned in questions about a related conundrum: how to think about the inherent worth and dignity of somebody who tramples the inherent worth and dignity of others, right? What does it mean to affirm the inherent worth and dignity of a terrible or a dangerous or a fill-in-the-blank person? Also, do we really have to? Right, that was a question. Some of you wrote the president's name in the blank. Fundamentally, these questions are about disagreements. That might seem like a pretty understated way to describe our country right now. We are in a state of disagreement, but that is what it is. There's conflict. It is deep. It has not only civil and human rights implications, but life or death implications. Issues of health care and racial bias, economics, addiction, migration, and gender identity impact lives in very direct, sometimes irreversible ways. And so the question is how to apply our Unitarian Universalist values when things are this difficult and the stakes are this high, when we or our loved ones or neighbors are being hurt. There's been some fretting about the loss of civility in our country, and I've heard this fretting inside and outside of our congregation. In a lecture delivered in Australia, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Bret Stephens laments that Americans have lost the ability to disagree well. For one thing, he says, disagreement has become so personal. People with differing political beliefs are likely not only to disagree, but also to think of each other as morally corrupt because of the disagreements. Fully 50% of Republicans would not want their child to marry a Democrat, and nearly 1/3 of Democrats return the sentiment, he says. Inter-party marriage has taken the place of interracial marriage as a family taboo. Stevens recalls traditional liberal arts education, which modeled a high tolerance for the debate of ideas, including terrible ideas. He cites some of the classics in Western thought and history, like Plato's Republic, in which men debate theories about things like justice and how to organize societies. Stevens argues that it's important for us to be in sincere conversation with one another because, quote, to disagree well, you must first understand well. You have to read deeply, listen carefully, and watch closely. You need to grant your adversary moral respect, give them the intellectual benefit of the doubt, have sympathy for their motives, and participate empathetically with their line of reasoning. This is true. To disagree well, you must understand well. In order to be effective in your own argument or response, you must not only understand your own position, but that of the other side. And not only each other's position, but also the needs or the interests to which that position is a response. What's beneath the surface? Civil dialogue is a crucial piece of being disagreeable, right? Being able to successfully navigate disagreement. That's where we get opportunities for deeper understanding. When both sides are wondering how on earth each other could possibly believe as they do, we can only answer that question by listening intently and asking earnest questions and speaking our truths from a place of compassion and a will toward peacemaking. At the same time, the insistence that we only engage in civil dialogue has historically mostly come from Americans whose right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is not under imminent threat. It's also true that those who hold privilege and power have rarely given it up based on civil discourse. Right? Sometimes America remembers the civil rights movement as being an example of polite or civil discourse because it was centered in nonviolence. But nonviolence is not the same as politeness. Right? Civil rights leaders created a movement that was both gentle and fierce. Activists sang songs of love and faith, and they blocked traffic and disrupted business, and they cranked up the discomfort and pressure in society until those in power finally chose to share some power by granting voting rights and integrating schools. Martin Luther King Jr. was fiercely critical of those who advocated for civility. In his letter from the Birmingham jail, he wrote, I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action. A Gallup poll in 1966 showed that 2/3 of Americans held an unfavorable opinion of Martin Luther King Jr. The historian Thomas Sugrue writes, that history is a reminder that civility is in the eye of the beholder. And when the beholder wants to maintain an unequal status quo, it's easy to accuse picketers, protesters, and preachers alike of incivility, as much because of their message as their methods. For those upset by disruptive protests, the history of civil rights offers an unsettling reminder that the path to change is seldom polite. So, is it okay to shout the Department of Homeland Security secretary out of a Mexican restaurant? That happened last June to Kristen Nielsen. A group of people started yelling shame, shame at her because of the children being torn away from their parents and jailed at the US-Mexican border. Or how about when a customer at a Spita Mezcaleria in Washington, D.C. saw White House advisor Stephen Miller there that same week and called him a fascist to his face? I'm still struck by the optics of those two eating at Mexican restaurants. They must have completely failed to draw a connection between the anti-immigrant rhetoric they defended and the human beings they actually encounter and depend on. How about just refusing to serve someone? That happened to Sarah Huckabee Sanders that same week at another restaurant where the workers and the owner felt that the Trump administration's behavior was so unethical they couldn't not do something in response. Several of the restaurant workers were gay, and the administration had also just applauded a Supreme Court decision upholding the right of a baker in Colorado to refuse a cake to a gay couple getting married. So were the restaurant owner and the workers teaching Huckabee Sanders something about what it is like to be turned away? Or were they being discriminatory themselves? That was the controversy. Or how about last May when I joined the Poor People's Campaign in Washington, D.C.? The Poor People's Campaign is a continuation of Martin Luther King Jr.'s work. He started a campaign by the same name in the 60s. I put on a vest and I helped to direct a crowd of protesters right into the streets in D.C., blocking traffic, yelling, singing, and standing their ground until they had all been arrested. The president of our denomination, the Reverend Susan Frederick Gray, was one of them, right there. A couple of weeks ago, I shared the story of Sherry Maples, a police officer who became a Buddhist, and she wondered how she would ever be able to practice compassion in her line of work. And then she learned about the concept of the fierce bodhisattva. Bodhisattva, as I said, is somebody who takes up the path of the Buddha in their lives, practicing mindfulness and compassion. And there are often images of fierce bodhisattvas at Buddhist temples. Maples says, sometimes there's a gentle-faced bodhisattva of compassion, and sometimes there's a fierce-faced bodhisattva of compassion. Wisdom is knowing which one is called for and when. As much as we might want a list of absolutes, like a list of commandments that are clear and universal in their application, the true work of peacemaking is often more complex than that. If we understand peace not just as negative peace, that is the absence of tension, but as positive peace, that is the presence of justice, then the path requires more of us than just obedience of some kind. Even the Bible actually demonstrates this, as after the 10 Commandments are laid out, there is story after story of other responses of knowing what is called for and when. But it doesn't mean we can just do whatever we want. It is, as the Dalai Lama has said, learn the rules very well so you know how to disobey them properly. Right? My favorite quotes, I love that. Learn the rules very well so you know how to disobey them properly. We have to be diligent in examining our own motives. Are we acting out of anger or compassion? Are we acting out of beliefs that are divisive, separating the saved from the unsaved and friends from enemies? Are we acting as though some people are unsavable? Or are we acting from beliefs that are bonds in a world community? And we have to pay attention to the patterns or behavior we are setting up and modeling as much as we pay attention to making our point. Let's go back to this question of what it means and what it looks like to respect the inherent worth and dignity of another human, a difficult human. It does not mean letting them do what they want, but it means we do not treat them as though their lives or their suffering or their needs are worthless or meaningless. It means acknowledging that they too are suffering. The civil rights activist turned wise elder, Ruby Sales, asks, where does it hurt? And she asks, where is the public theology for someone who has been told that their whole essence is whiteness and power and domination? And when that no longer exists, then they feel as if they are dying or they get caught up in the throes of death. Reading her words yesterday, I thought of the white man on the Columbia University campus last weekend who shouted racist remarks at a group of students of color. It was about 3 a.m. He was aggressive and scary, and in the middle of a lot of horrible things, he said, I love myself and I love my people. His voice was cracking because he was so worked up emotionally. One of the students of color had taken out their phone to record him because it seemed like he might turn violent. And in a hoarse voice, he said, look, I don't hate other people. I just love white men. Where is the theology that redefines to them what it means to be fully human? Ruby Sales asks. She says she doesn't hear any of that coming out of any place today. Our faith challenges us to step up, right up to disagreement and protest and disruption and civil dialogue, as though we believe everyone is deserving of and capable of becoming fully human, oppressor and oppressed alike. There might be times when we sincerely doubt that, when we are so shocked or devastated or outraged that we do feel like shutting somebody all the way out forever. But if we act on that, then that is the world we will build, a world that separates the saved from the unsaved, a world with some people still on the outside, a world that looks like a mirror image of the world we have now. So faith is doing differently even when we are filled with anger and doubt. It's leaving room for enemies to become friends. It's speaking the truth about harm and bigotry and cruelty without demonizing the person we are speaking to. Call them whatever you want in private, okay? Get it out. Anger is okay. Doubt is okay. But be careful what you put into the world you are helping to create. Living into our first principle might entail wearing a gentle face or a fierce face. It may entail conversation or disruption, but it is having an expansive heart. The heart of a Unitarian who knows that at the end of the day, we are one, united, tied together in the single garment of destiny, as King said, that we belong to each other, that we are interconnected. And living into our first principle is having the heart of a universalist who wants everybody inside the circle, belonging in wholeness and community and peace. That is Unitarian Universalism. I wish I had a set of easy answers for today. Instead, this sermon feels like the middle part of a conversation. It is the middle part of a conversation. Like you, with you, I am also figuring out how to live in this world right now. This world with one new populist leader after another, and with rising anti-Semitism and white nationalism, and an economy tipped toward the outrageously wealthy with its contents just rolling and rolling into their pockets. And people losing everything because they got sick and they couldn't afford to be healed. I don't know all the answers. We don't know all the answers, and yet we are living the answers. What we do and how we are and what we believe become answers. And what I know is I don't want these walls, these curving, embracing walls, to close around us like a fortress or like a border wall. I want them to stay open and to draw more and more people in. I want everybody to be able to imagine themselves here. I want for us to, in all that we do, to pray toward the embrace and the welcome and that one light. Will you join me in our closing hymn?